It is astronomical. It varies across different programs, of course, but on average, we're seeing at least double, if not up to 100 times or more, vulnerability reports, and a lot of those are turning out to be real bugs. If you just look at Firefox and their increase from their average of a few dozen, maybe at peak before AI vulnerabilities being patched in a month to over 450 patched in a month. And Microsoft is also, showing large increases, and they have said to not expect that volume to diminish for quite some time.
So this week, SecOps Weekly, we have a very, very special guest. So Katie, thank you so much for joining us. I think in general, you probably need like little introduction, but really appreciate you taking the time to join us and chat today. So we're going to dive right in. We've got a good bit of stuff to cover. And I kind of want, like, just by way of introduction, to take a moment, if you would, explain to everyone, like the topic at hand here, like, but this is an interesting space that's like obviously been front and center in the news, front and center like at the federal government and regulatory level, and obviously has some direct and indirect impacts on like what you do for a living. But like, if you would just maybe take a moment and just kind of explain what your experience has been these last few weeks. I think you've kind of had so much exposure to research and policy and obviously like the market side of this. So if you would just maybe just share with everyone a little bit about like what you've seen and just kind of how much momentum this has from your perspective.
Well, it seems like, and thanks so much for having me, Keith, on here, but it seems like everybody is freaked out to some extent about AI, and especially in cybersecurity. And I think we just saw evidence of that freak out happen a couple weeks ago when the US government slapped some export controls on the latest models of Anthropic's models of AI. And so, how I found myself here most recently is that I reviewed a paper that apparently caused some of that panic and concerns that the capabilities of these models were not adequately being safeguarded. And there was a paper that alleged a jailbreak, and we can go into more details in that about that a little bit later. But really, what I'm seeing, honestly, is we've crossed some sort of event horizon where AI can find vulnerabilities faster than humans can fix them. And even when humans are able to create patches, deploying those patches is quite a challenge. So that's kind of where we are right now. And yeah, we can just go into more as we go on in the conversation.
Also, well, yeah. So let's like I think you kind of already touched on this a little bit, but the reason, like I think just in general that we wanted to have this conversation, and thanks again for taking the time. You've been extremely busy, but maybe give us a second, like I think what you do for a living, and I think, but and then also like when we think through like why we're talking about this, like one aspect of that like is like very direct related to just like volume of vulnerabilities, the ease with which I guess like increasingly inexperienced folks may be able to find them, and just kind of the general proliferation of like bugs, vulnerabilities, subset of those being exploitable. Like, what's that look like to you from your perspective, like on the business side? You've kind of mentioned some of the numbers, and it just sounds like it is literally hockey sticking, but maybe in all the wrong ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, I run Luta Security, which helps organizations manage their bug bounty programs and vulnerability disclosure programs. But, we've been doing this for over a decade at Luta, but I created Microsoft's first bug bounty programs and the Pentagon's first bug bounty program. So I'm used to volume and, high potential for targeting in terms of a lot of researchers going after and trying to find and report bugs to these kinds of institutions. So a lot of this stuff wasn't anything that we hadn't seen before. It's just that we hadn't seen it at scale across every bug bounty program and every vulnerability disclosure program. And the reason for that is that AI is helping, well, it's helping write reports that sound really good. At first, programs were overwhelmed with AI slop, it was called, because they were hallucinated. And now more and more of those AI reports are turning out to be real, but how exploitable they are and, to what extent there may be duplicates of other reports, because if you're all using the same AI tools, you're probably going to find a lot of the same bugs. But it is definitely lowering the skill bar for entry into this area of vulnerability research.
And when you like, just in terms of, like just I'd say like the throughput in terms of like the system that you deal with and just like bug bounties and vulnerability reports, like, is that been from your experience so far? Like, is it 2x? Is it 10x? Like how, like what's the, I think we all kind of read the news and it's just, you read about open source developers in particular who are kind of, in a unique position, in that they like, unlike a huge corporation, can't absorb so many of these things. Like that's kind of all we hear about, but it sounds anecdotal. Like how measurable is the increase in volume from your perspective?
It is astronomical. It varies across different programs, of course, but on average, we're seeing at least double, if not up to 100 times or more, vulnerability reports, and a lot of those are turning out to be real bugs. If you just look at Firefox and their increase from their average of a few dozen, maybe at peak before AI vulnerabilities being patched in a month to over 450 patched in a month. And Microsoft is also, showing large increases, and they have said to not expect that volume to diminish for quite some time.
And now, given what Luta does, kind of it may sound counterintuitive, but we were kind of chatting about this, and even just kind of reading, like in podcasts you've been on, and some of like the commentary you've been providing to the news. Um, it was a little bit surprising to me to read like your general advice is like, all right, like don't try to take this head on by standing up a bug bounty program right now. And I think one of the things that we wanted to kind of, I think a unique perspective that folks aren't hearing is like, why do you say that? And then I think, we kind of turn towards like what AI has kind of shown a light on. It's a little bit of like, on the one hand, it seems like it would be great if everyone wanted to start a bug bounty program. I'm sure that would be terrific for business. But, when you kind of take a step back and think about like what we're really learning from all of this, what is the advice that you give folks? And I guess like what's kind of the the overarching observation that's a little bit bigger than like what the company does. It's like focusing on what the industry should do.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's funny is that over the past decade, we've been the first ones to tell organizations when they should not start a bug bounty because their internal processes aren't mature enough. And now it seems like the industry is kind of catching up with that and realizing, I think everyone at this point realizes it's a bad time to start a bug bounty program if you haven't, been trying to do it already. It's really not a great time to be testing all of those internal processes, and they're struggling with the bugs that they already know about. So, when we look at organizations who come to us wanting to do bug bounty programs, we start with a maturity assessment, and that's really about internal processes because it's really never been that finding the bugs was the hardest part of this process. It's wrapped up in triage, but also in what bugs to fix and how to prioritize them in context. If they're your own bugs in your own software that you wrote, how do you prioritize that context with affected customers? And whether or not something is highly exploitable versus less exploitable, and hard to reach, and all of those different factors come into play. So really, we're looking at things from a context is king perspective, and everyone seems to be catching up with that mantra, although we've been doing it for a decade or more.
The when you kind of talk about just like that context in particular, it feels like this phrase is still not perfectly defined. I think it kind of means like everything and nothing, but like that concept of like shifting from vulnerability management or bug triage into like that more holistic exposure management, like that concept where it's like, yeah, you take those gaps, like those known forever gaps, and then there's some obviously like that you just, I'd say like more emerging that you're just learning about now. Um, and figuring out how to synthesize all of that. And it's like there's a subset of those things that you do need to deal with this moment, but the vast majority, you still have a little bit of time. And it's just that concept of like, um, I don't know. Yeah, I guess I love the the phrase we kind of stole from you, which is like it's really just kind of shining a light on a lot of these like really, really foundational operational practices and processes. And I think some to a large extent just a fundamentally different and kind of like, more vertically integrated way of thinking about security, which is not just like your vuln people over here and your detection and response people over here. And so I think that's it is like it's definitely been very eye-opening for sure. And it's an interesting way to think about the problem. So I want to shift and maybe let's talk through like let's dig into that a little bit because when we say foundational problems, like wanted to just kind of give you an opportunity to share from your perspective, like what some of those really, really big ones are. Like when there's obviously, like wide variety, I guess, of like things we've advised companies to do or that we wished our companies had done. But I think there is a short list that that maybe matter or like are higher leverage than others.
Well, I mean, the main thing here is your objective is to reduce your overall attack surface. There is no way that you can keep up with the patch volume that there is coming down the pipe if you're just frantically trying to patch everything and too many things are exposed directly to the internet, too many services, too many capabilities of your organization are exposed. So reducing that attack surface and however you get there is less important than trying to get there as quickly as possible. So we've all been preaching zero trust architectures, but the word architecture should tip you off that this is not something you can pull off overnight. It can get you buy-in from at an organizational level to finally do some of these longer range preventative measures where you're segmenting your network and you are implementing strong identity management and all of those things. But reducing the attack surface is the goal. Now, while you're doing all of that stuff, you really need to get better at intrusion detection because the fact of the matter is the time between a vulnerability becoming known and it being widely exploited is pretty much reduced to zero. You used to have maybe a few days of grace if you were lucky, if you weren't a main character energy target type of thing, as the kids would say. But I think that at this point, organizations really don't have any leeway. So getting to a place where you can reduce your attack surface overall for the longer term sustainability of your network and your vulnerability management is great. But also getting really good at incident response and detection and containment.
And just to dig in, to spend a moment on just like, I think that relationship between attack surface and zero trust too, like um, zero trust again being kind of a journey, but let's assume like, assume someone like is fairly far along on that journey. Um, that like that alone, like just the attack surface reduction that comes from treating like devices as more of an island. It's like, I guess the difference between like a big flat campus network and thinking of a corporate environment more like a cell phone network, right? Where like my phone can't talk to your phone. By default, everything just has a path to a switchboard, and then being able to put in some fine grain like positive controls there. Um, but when you think about that think about like zero trust principles in particular, right? Like where do you recommend folks start on that journey? Like if you had to start another company today, like what are the 2 to 3 things you would have put in place, like full stop?
Well, I mean, if I were starting a company, I would probably outsource as much as humanly possible, right? Get the big cloud providers to do a lot of this stuff for you. So for smaller businesses, that's probably the way. If you're a larger, more specialized business that takes care of your own infrastructure, then certainly things that you get started on with zero trust are things like robust identity management. You cannot actually manage your access management if if you don't know who is acting, and that could be people, that could be systems, and some mix of the two. And at this point, we also have AI agents who also need their own identities to be tracked, audited, monitored for them stepping out of their prescribed role and purpose and all of that stuff. But really, it starts with strong identity management in any zero trust configuration. So if you build that foundation, you'll have an easier time implementing those finer grained controls because you know at least who is trying to do what and where.
I feel like we could probably spend an entire half hour talking about kind of agents and what they've done. And like, I think that's been maybe the most interesting, I won't say unsolved, because I do think, a lot of the first principles are the same, but I will say like that seems to be where, we kind of think about like what our customers are asking for and operationally how they're trying to square what you just said, which is just keep a handle on identity, control them tightly. And now I think, that is like just the velocity behind like agentic workloads. It kind of feels like it's taken us, call it 10, 20, 30 years to get passable at identity management in a corporate environment. And now we're trying to figure out how to manage like exponentially more of those, but we don't have years right now. We've got like weeks or months to kind of figure that out. That's been it's been an interesting shift to observe, just like, talking to folks who are kind of on the front lines of trying to put this stuff in place. So we kind of talked about those, like, I'd say maybe foundational processes like preventative controls, just building and architecting systems so that there's less attack surface in general. And that so, if there's an incident, you're in a better position to respond, right? Like you're kind of in a default containment position with zero trust. Let's talk a little bit more about kind of like, what you do, like what we're all going to experience incidents. So that's a given. So take us through these, because I think this was like an interesting kind of framing that I've not seen when we kind of ask, when everyone is asked, like, what do I do about AI? The response is usually, depending on what they're selling or kind of what their soapbox is, like this pretty prescribed set of things. But like, take us through this. Like, why, from your perspective, like, are these the three pillars, and kind of like how do they interact or relate to one another?
Well, we are really looking at a situation where it's a bit of an emergency, and a lot of organizations weren't prepared. So, while you're trying to get your ducks in a row and your budgets aligned and all of that to get some of the deeper changes done that will make your organization more resilient, you really need to stop the bleeding. And like I mentioned, stepping up your intrusion detection is one of the key bits about that. You are simultaneously trying to build the railroad tracks in front of you of your defenses while the train is moving at full speed. So you better know, if there are any rocks in the way and any, type of attackers that are already resident on your network. So getting that set up is going to get you quite a long way towards stopping the bleeding. And then, once you have time to catch your breath, it is really a good time, especially if you're writing your own code, to look upstream. How did these bugs end up here in the first place? What can we do to prevent them from ever entering the code again? Are there SaaS templates that you can create based on bug findings, from your vulnerability disclosure programs? Are there different other interventions in terms of introducing agentic checking of your code as it's possibly being generated by AI as we speak? And then understanding, how all those pieces fit together, but really looking for those patterns that you can try to prevent bugs from creeping in the future. And there are even patterns in your vulnerability management. So let's say you don't write your own code and you're just deploying other people's code. There are patterns, to be found in your vulnerability management such that you can look upstream and say, wow, okay, we're getting a lot of these intrusions and or hopefully bug reports before intrusions happen. But however we're learning about these exposures, we can maybe improve and accelerate our vulnerability management and potentially do some smarter prioritization of patch rollouts, because perhaps we were doing it from the most critical bugs first, and maybe we actually needed to do it from the perimeter first, no matter what the criticality was. So there's some practical ways that you can tune your experiences here. And then finally, of course, these intrusions are going to happen, so you need a good recovery plan.
So if I'm glad you kind of mentioned the, excuse me, the aspect of that applies to folks that don't, I'd say the majority of folks are probably in the position where like they can't control the code they don't write most of the code that they use, right? They like use SaaS software. they're sold a bunch of things by third parties. And so like your ability to control like the true root causes is very limited. But I want to push for a second on, we kind of like what we have ended up dealing with is trying to figure out what I would consider to be a lot of diving saves, right? So like a lot of these open source supply chain attacks that in a lot of cases, may be dormant for days, weeks, months, and then that switch flips and all of a sudden, like that threat actor decides to kind of leverage the capability that's been staged. Um, how are you advising folks to deal with that? Like with that problem in particular, where it's like that code is being kind of used and brought into an ecosystem. you know, we build software, so we have some control over that, like cooldown periods, things like that. But again, 99% of companies just wake up and open the web browser and they use what they use. Like, how can they deal with that when you're purely on the consumer side of like this just wild proliferation of vulnerabilities?
Well, that is going to go fall back into your detection and recovery for the most part, because in a lot of these cases, like you said, they don't have control over the software that they're running and they're waiting for a patch. And in cases where it's an open source library where there are multiple pieces of software all throughout your technology stack that are affected, you are going to be in a situation where you don't even have the patches to apply yet because the vendors are scrambling. This is what happened in the Log4j, Log4Shell incident. And, I was part of the Cyber Safety Review Board stood up by CISA that examined that vulnerability response and reaction by the industry. So we definitely found a pattern that the organizations that were best equipped to deal with a situation like that in a widespread open source library that affected multiple pieces of software were the ones that had drilled these events before, that they had, ways of communicating and mobilizing internally. And this was not, essentially them learning on the fly. They knew what their assets were, which ones were the most important, so they could do that prioritization when they did get some kinds of patches or mitigations, and they were prepared to run with whatever was coming down the pipe. Now, I'm sad to report that Log4j was just one library, and we are probably staring down the barrel of possibly hundreds of these libraries that are affected. And we're seeing this, where the frontier models like Anthropic has reported that they found over 21,000 vulnerability candidates in open source software, and that trickled down to maybe about 1,500 valid, what they call true vulnerabilities, but that included some duplicates and ones that were hard to reach. And as of the 1 month in report from Anthropic, only 88 of those had been patched. So you are going to be in this situation and possibly across hundreds, if not thousands, of different open source packages. Knowing your assets and having a team that has done this before, or at least drilled the, all of the different incident response levers that they'll have to pull, that's going to be your key to resilience in these scenarios.
Maybe one of the just a couple weeks ago, we are talking through the concept of just identity security and a lot of like this the telemetry and kind of how to prepare for these things. And I think there's like because I hear you say that, and then I kind of think, the reality, which is like for a lot of our customers, like there's just such a tremendous asymmetry in terms of like all of the attack surface and the problem space that they're staring down, and then the realities of like their team and their workload, which in a lot of cases is like IT people, and for them, cybersecurity is other duties is assigned, right? And like they are doing their best. But just kind of thinking back to what you said earlier about like, if you had to kind of choose a going in position and like try to set up a position of strength, even in a team, even in a company without a big team, um, just kind of thinking through in my head, like, resilience and preparedness in a lot of these cases can be, and maybe the best thing you could do is just like have good identity visibility and telemetry and understand where to go look. Like for most organizations, it might be as simple as like, you're probably just going to have to learn about it from the news and maybe eventually from a vendor sending you an email. And just understanding, hey, when this happens, like I need to go look at X and Y and Z. Um, if only to figure out like who's interacted like with the systems that have these vulnerabilities and like I don't know, just like a lot of times we kind of I think think about resilience and like preparedness as a thing that's really complicated, and I'm just like, the simplicity of what you said about like just start with identity and then thinking through what that might mean, for like an individual company is like, I think it's an interesting exercise. So, all right. So this is where I'm like really, really interested. And I want you to kind of take us through, how you see this changing over the next like year plus, because I think it like right now it feels like 18 months worth of change and evolution, 18 months worth of bugs. Like it feels like that's happening every 30 days. Like that feels like the hamster wheel we're on. Um, you've been spending so much time thinking about this. Like take us through kind of your read on like that landscape looking ahead a year plus.
Well, look, we actually don't know. 18 months is a guess, is anyone's guess, and it could be shorter for some capabilities to catch up with the open source models, being able to catch up with the latest frontier models, foreign models, certainly doing their own research into AI, but also doing distillation attacks where they are gaining capabilities by repeatedly querying our frontier models, and that is, an ongoing threat that foreign adversaries may build these capabilities that way and much quicker than, the 18-month horizon here. But I think everyone agrees that in 18 months, everything will look pretty different. And the agents themselves are going to be more powerful and capable. Whatever guardrails either this administration or various countries' administrations decide to impose and require the frontier models to impose, there's always the possibility that those guardrails, one, won't be universally imposed. We've got here on the slide, Fable 5 has guardrails, GPT 5.5 not so much. They can find the same bugs, and yet Fable 5 is the one that's under export controls right now. It is being sort of rolled out to some limited approved critical infrastructure partners again. So it's been a little bit lifted in that sense, those export controls. But what do we do when, all of these capabilities are accelerating towards essentially being better than the best cybersecurity researcher or analyst, and in the hands of attackers? What I worry about with guardrails and the imposition of, things like export controls, to try to enforce the creation of guardrails is that the tighter you make them, the harder it is for defenders to use these models in the ways that they were intended to be used for defense. So no matter what happens, in this forecast, whether it's a month from now, 3 months from now, or a whopping 18 months from now that we see all these capabilities increasing, the one thing that I want to make sure of in this, as we evolve here, is that defenders get access to everything attackers do. It's like our Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's our only hope.
Yeah, you were, I know you were a guest on the Three Buddy Problem podcast a while ago. I think that's, Jags has kind of talked about that extensively, which is like those guardrails that are, we put them in there so that you can't do bad things with it. But that feels like a really, really like challenging cat and mouse problem, because it is like there's, intent is, I think, largely the difference between like whether you're doing a bad thing or whether you're trying to learn about it so you can defend. And it is like it's, I don't know, it's hard to see how we kind of break out of that cycle of like, reacting to these things like in a very like these just wild pendulum swings where, like you said, we, put export controls on one, but we now know that, and it's not just obviously like Fable and like GPT, this like all the open weight models and the open source models. I think there's plenty of proof now that you can do great or terrible things with almost any of these. So that's yeah, it's an interesting perspective to think through, and curious how we navigate through it. We've got a couple minutes left. I want to take one question because there's a great one here, and I think you might be, I think you are uniquely suited to answer it. So I'll paraphrase, but like Andrew is asking, how do you like make senior leadership take vulnerabilities seriously? And how do you do that in a way that helps avoid the panic? It's like I think, if I'm summarizing the intent of his question, like senior leadership is paying attention, but they're paying attention because they see it in the news and then they panic and they react and they demand answers. Like what's your kind of like, what's the advice you give to folks to help kind of like coach up and prepare leadership, particularly like in non-technical areas, like for these types of events? And like, how do you have, like, what would you advise in that situation?
Well, when we do maturity assessments of organizations, we look at several capability areas. And the biggest predictors of success in either vulnerability disclosure or their cybersecurity program writ large is the organizational commitment. So you're right to ask this question. And the organizational commitment, is represented by senior leadership's will to do something about this, not just do something in the short term, but invest for the long term. I think right now is a great time to write up your short, medium, and long-term proposals for how to deal with these things. I know that at Microsoft, a lot of the programs that I created, we would circulate this one pager, quote unquote one pager. Sometimes it was like 11 pages long, but essentially it would provide a roadmap and say, this is our crawl, walk, run plan for how we're going to address, problem A. And you would get feedback from, peers and others adjacent to senior leadership. So, for example, if you're trying to internally push for better vulnerability management or maybe better integration between the incident response team and the vulnerability management team, if they're separate, you would go to the leaders of those teams and figure out what are the barriers right now to any kind of siloing that is making their work function more independently than it should. And what would how can you enable them to better integrate those kinds of responses so that it's a more seamless handoff internally. But that's just one example of things that you might put into a plan. Every organization is different. Some literally just don't have enough people. And if you're going to make a headcount argument, you should probably back it up with why. What is your mean time to repair and why is that a problem now? All of those kinds of things. But overall, it is the organizational preparedness when we do those maturity assessments, plus the communication preparedness. And that doesn't mean just communicating with, let's say, security researchers. It really means communicating up and down your leadership chain. So from the people who are doing the work itself and what they are seeing, all the way up to senior leadership so they can better support those folks and align towards the goals of your business, the goals of your organization. But that communication capability internally and externally around cybersecurity is super important and a predictor of success. And I would say, get your short, medium, and long-term plans in a row and have justifications and data for everything that you're asking for.
And I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but I like trying to think through like how to synthesize, I think, a lot of what we talked about for most of the last half hour. And that is like, I think there's also an interesting aspect of it, which is probably, I think was counterintuitive to me before we had this discussion, which is that like maybe the best way to approach it is also just like don't fixate on vulnerabilities and vulnerability management. It's like helping leadership understand the relationship between like what happens when there's a vulnerability that's exploited and your foundational, your foundational controls, right? So like what's the benefit of having, strong identity management, and what's the benefit of having zero trust principles and architecture in place? And what's the relationship between those things, which is like, I think that, definitely not always apparent to folks. So,
Well, never waste a good crisis, right? And right now we're in an industry-wide crisis around AI. But, for every incident that you have, especially a major one, take a look, do a postmortem, and then try to make recommendations internally that would prevent certain of the catastrophic events that you observed happening from happening again in the future. And, ideally, we're all getting iteratively better at this. But like I said, no organization is perfect, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity for growth and improvement, and we should take it.
I love that. Well, that's a perfect place to wrap. We've gone a few minutes over. I appreciate you taking a minute to kind of talk through that question, because I do think that was like that's great, and it seems like that was useful advice to a lot of folks here. Katie, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. This has been one of the coolest conversations and opportunities we've had. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, and thanks everyone for joining us. As a reminder, there won't be any show next week. We're taking a brief summer break, but we'll be back here in 2 weeks with some discussion of RMM tools and a little bit of attack surface reduction. So thank you
All
very
right.
much. Appreciate it. Thank you,
Thanks
Katie.
so much. Thanks.
Cheers.